March 10, 1945. The B-29 Storm Belle climbed through darkness over Tinian Island, engines roaring against the weight of 7.2 tons of incendiary bombs. Captain Robert Hensley felt the vibration before the instruments confirmed it. Engine number 3 was dying. Standard protocol demanded an abort, but 11 other bombers were already committed to the first low-altitude night raid on Tokyo, and General Curtis LeMay's orders left no room for individual conscience. Hensley's hand hovered over the abort switch while his engineer called out pressure readings that grew worse with each second. Below, 1,500 miles of Black Pacific waited. Ahead, a city that would burn. Hensley wasn't supposed to be a bomber pilot. He'd studied mechanical engineering at Kansas State for 2 years before the draft notice arrived in December 1942. His father ran a machine shop in Wichita, where Bob had learned to diagnose problems by sound alone. The tick of a misaligned lathe bearing, the whine of metal fatigue, the subtle change in pitch that meant something was about to fail. The Army Air Forces recognized that talent. After basic flight training, they sent him to B-29 transition school at Walker Field in Kansas. The Superfortress was the most complex aircraft ever built. 4 Wright R-35-0 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower. Remote-controlled gun turrets, pressurized cabin, a maze of hydraulic, electrical, and fuel systems that required constant attention. Hensley approached each flight like a mathematical problem. He calculated fuel consumption to the gallon, tracked engine temperatures within 2-degree margins, kept a notebook with performance curves for different altitudes, weights, and atmospheric conditions. Other pilots called him obsessive. His crew called him reliable. The men who flew with him understood the difference. Flight engineer Frank Cooley had watched Hensley nurse a damaged B-29 back from a mission over Nagoya 3 weeks earlier, flying for 2 hours on 3 engines while maintaining altitude within 50 feet of optimal glide ratio. Navigator Walter Dempsey trusted Hensley's calculations more than his own sometimes. The captain could estimate wind drift by watching cloud shadows and correct course before the drift became critical. But tonight's mission tested a different kind of calculation. LeMay had stripped the bombers of most defensive armament to increase bomb load and ordered them to attack at 6,000 feet instead of the usual 25,000. Lower altitude meant better accuracy, but also put them in range of every anti-aircraft gun in Tokyo. It was aggressive, risky, and completely contrary to everything Hensley believed about measured risk. He'd argued against it in the briefing. Been overruled. Now he was committed. The vibration in Engine 3 started as a flutter, barely perceptible through the control yoke. Cooley noticed it first on his instrument panel. Oil pressure dropping, temperature climbing. The telltale signs of a seal failure in the propeller hub. "Captain, number 3 is losing oil." Cooley's voice came through the intercom, calm but urgent. 20 pounds per square inch and falling. Hensley's eyes moved across his own gauges. Engine 3 still showed 85% power, but the trend was clear. In another hour, maybe less, that engine would seize. Standard operating procedure was explicit. Abort if oil pressure dropped to below critical minimums. Return to base. Let the ground crew fix it. Live to fly another day. But aborting meant the formation would be unbalanced. 11 bombers instead of 12. Defensive fire patterns disrupted. And Tokyo would burn a little less tonight. Hensley did the math in his head. With careful power management, Engine 3 could run another 6 hours before failure became critical. The mission profile called for 5 hours to target, 1 hour over Tokyo, then the return flight. They could make it to the target and back on 3 engines if necessary. The decision violated protocol. It risked his crew. But Hensley had learned that sometimes the book's answer wasn't the right answer. "Frank, can you maintain that engine at 75% power?" "Yes, sir. I'll monitor it every 5 minutes." "Do it. We're continuing." No one on the crew questioned him. They'd learned to trust his calculations. The Storm Belle droned westward through the night. Every 300 seconds, Cooley adjusted the fuel mixture to engine 3, nursing it like a sick patient. The other 3 engines picked up the slack, running slightly hotter than optimal, but within acceptable limits. Below, the Pacific stretched endlessly dark. No navigation lights, no radio beacons, nothing but stars and Walter Dempsey's dead reckoning to guide them. The B-29s maintained strict radio silence. If one aircraft went down, the others would never know. Hensley checked his watch. 4 hours to Japan. The engine was holding. For now. Dawn never came. Instead, Tokyo appeared as a red glow on the horizon, visible 80 miles away. The first wave of bombers had already hit, and the city was burning. Dempsey verified their position against the radar return. The AN APQ-13 set showed a dense flickering image. Not buildings, smoke. Thermal turbulence from fires that were consuming entire neighborhoods. "Initial point in 7 minutes," Dempsey announced. Hensley began the descent from 12,000 feet to 6,000. The B-29 dropped through layers of cold air, each one making the airframe groan. At 8,000 feet, they hit turbulence. Hot air rising from the fires below created invisible walls that slammed the aircraft sideways. The crew felt it in their bones. The taste of metal in the pressurized cabin, the smell of hydraulic fluid and hot electrical insulation. The constant vibration that made their teeth ache. At 6,000 feet, they were inside the war. Tail gunner Mel Kramer saw them first. Fighters, 7 o'clock low. 2 Japanese Ki-45 night fighters, painted black, curved up toward the bomber stream. Their 20mm cannons opened fire at 800 yards. Tracer rounds drew bright lines through the darkness. The Storm Belle shuddered. Cannon shells struck the left stabilizer, punching through aluminum skin like paper. More hits stitched across the rear fuselage. Fragments tore through hydraulic lines. Fuel misted from a punctured transfer line. Hensley felt the aircraft's response change instantly. The rudder pedals had less resistance. Secondary hydraulic pressure dropping. He switched to the primary system and made a note. "Fuel leak, tank 2, Cooley reported. 70 liters per minute." Hensley calculated automatically. At 70 liters per minute, they had 90 minutes of fuel before tank 2 was empty. But tank 2 fed engines 1 and 4. Losing it meant flying on 2 engines. They were 15 miles from the target. No turning back now. Radio operator Alan Pierce tried to contact the formation leader. The HF transmitter had been marginal since takeoff, and now it was completely useless. Static and interference filled every frequency. They were alone in a sky full of burning aircraft and enemy fighters, unable to call for help or coordinate with other bombers. Hensley made the decision without consultation. "We're going in solo. Walt, give me the bombing coordinates." Dempsey aligned the Norden bomb site with the target area in Kodo District. Factory complexes, rail yards, dense residential areas that housed war workers. The ethics of what they were about to do sat like lead in Hensley's stomach, but he'd stopped thinking about that months ago. You couldn't fly these missions and maintain moral clarity. You just did the job. At 2:28 a.m., they reached the release point. Below, Tokyo burned with an intensity that defied comprehension. Firestorms created by thousands of incendiary bombs merged into a single inferno. The thermal updraft hit the B-29 like a fist, lifting it 300 feet in seconds. Hensley fought the controls, trying to maintain level flight. "Bombs away," Dempsey announced. The bombardier toggled the release. 6,000 pounds of M69 incendiary clusters fell into the maelstrom. The aircraft lurched upward, suddenly lighter. Hensley trimmed for the new weight distribution. Then a 75mm anti-aircraft shell exploded 40 feet below them. The blast wave flipped the B-29 nearly inverted. Hensley and co-pilot Jerry Alcott both hauled on their yokes, fighting to roll level. Metal screamed. Rivets popped. The bomb bay doors, already weakened by heat, buckled inward. When they finally leveled out, every warning light on the panel was illuminated. Engine 3 temperature redlined. Engine 2 showing erratic RPM. Hydraulic pressure critical. Fuel flow restricted. They'd dropped their bombs. Now they had to survive the next 1,500 miles. Cooley worked without speaking, his hands moving across valves and switches with practiced efficiency. Engine 3 was cooking itself to death. The internal temperature had reached 240 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees below the point where the engine would catch fire. He adjusted the fuel mixture, leaning it out to reduce combustion heat. Cut power by 10%. Feathered the propeller partially to reduce drag. Every action was a compromise between keeping the engine alive and maintaining enough thrust to stay airborne. "Number 2 is showing shrapnel damage," he reported. "It'll run, but not at full power." Hensley did the math again. 2 engines at reduced power. 1 engine dying. 1 engine still healthy. Total thrust approximately 82% of normal. Fuel consumption higher because the remaining engines were working harder. Current fuel state, 2,200 liters for 1,600 kilometers to Tinian. Not enough. Not even close. "Jerry, calculate the distance to Iwo Jima." The co-pilot checked the charts. 900 kilometers, bearing 135. Iwo Jima, the volcanic rock island that Marines had captured a month ago at terrible cost. The airfield was still being expanded, barely operational. But it was their only chance. "New heading 135, Hensley ordered. Alcott looked at him. "They're not set up for night landings. No lights, no ILS approach. Then we'll land in daylight, if we make it that far." The debate that followed was brief and brutal. Alcott wanted to jettison everything: guns, ammunition, survival gear, anything that wasn't bolted down. Dempsey suggested dropping to 3,000 feet to reduce fuel consumption. Cooley advocated climbing to 10,000 feet for better fuel economy. Hensley overruled them all. "We stay at 8,000 feet. That gives us glide range if we lose another engine. Strip the guns, dump the ammunition, keep the survival gear in case we have to ditch." The crew went to work. Kramer dismantled the dorsal turret, disconnecting the ammunition feeds and letting 500 rounds of .50 caliber fall into the Pacific. The waist gunners threw out their ammunition boxes. The engineer drained excess oil from the healthy engines, saving weight at the cost of future engine life. They shed 550 pounds. It bought them maybe 30 more miles of range. Every 20 minutes, Hensley checked the fuel totalizer. The numbers dropped with horrifying steadiness. 1,900 liters, 1,700, 1,500. Each liter represented roughly 1 kilometer of range. They were racing their own consumption rate. The second fighter attack came without warning. 2 Ki-61 fighters, painted in mottled green camouflage, dove out of the pre-dawn darkness. Their 20mm cannons hammered the B-29's right wing, hunching holes through aluminum skin and into the fuel tanks. Kramer, working the only functional gun turret, fired back. Tracer rounds converged on the lead fighter. He saw hits spark along its fuselage, but it didn't break off. 11 more cannon shells struck the Storm Belle. 3 hit the right wing, shredding control surfaces. 2 penetrated the nose compartment, narrowly missing Dempsey. The rest stitched across the top of the fuselage, perforating the pressurized cabin. Air screamed out through the new holes. Pressure dropped. The crew scrambled for oxygen masks. Hensley felt the aircraft yaw right. The damaged wing was creating asymmetric drag. He pressed left rudder to compensate, but the force required made his legs shake. Flying this crippled bomber was becoming a physical fight. The second fighter made its pass. Kramer tracked it with the dorsal turret, leading it slightly, and fired a long burst. This time, he saw the fighter's canopy shatter. It rolled inverted and fell away, trailing black smoke. The attack ended as suddenly as it began. The surviving Japanese fighter broke off, apparently low on fuel or ammunition. Cooley completed his damage count, 600+ holes in the airframe, 2 engines compromised, fuel tanks leaking, hydraulic system running on emergency pressure. Oxygen reserves depleted to 15%. Flight time remaining, unknown. The B-29 was a flying wreck, but it was still flying. Hensley recalculated their position. They were 200 kilometers from the Japanese coast, 700 kilometers from Iwo Jima. With current fuel consumption and the drag from battle damage, they might make it, or they might ditch 50 miles short. He didn't share that calculation with the crew. They could do the math themselves. Engine 3 died at 5:30 a.m. The temperature gauge had been climbing for an hour, and Cooley had been fighting it the whole time. But there was no fighting physics. The oil was gone, the bearings were dry, and the pistons were welding themselves to the cylinder walls. A tongue of flame appeared at the cowling edge. "Shutting down number 3, Cooley announced. He pulled the fire suppression handle. Carbon dioxide flooded the engine compartment. The flames died. The propeller windmilled to a stop. The Storm Belle lurched. Flying on 3 engines created asymmetric thrust. The left wing wanted to drop. The nose wanted to yaw. Hensley trimmed as much as he could, but holding the aircraft level required constant pressure on the controls. His arms were starting to shake. Alcott took over, giving him a break. The co-pilot was a younger man, less experienced, but he'd learned from watching Hensley. He maintained altitude within 50 feet, holding the aircraft in a gentle slip that reduced drag on the dead engine's side. They were flying at 275 kilometers per hour, just 40 kilometers per hour above stall speed. The margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Hensley calculated their fuel state against the distance remaining. The math was close, dangerously close. If they encountered headwinds, they wouldn't make it. If they had to maneuver to avoid weather, they wouldn't make it. If engine 2 or 4 developed problems, they wouldn't make it. The only thing working in their favor was that dawn was breaking. In daylight, they could see the ocean, could find Iwo Jima visually if the radar failed, could attempt a landing without relying solely on instruments. At 6:15 a.m., Dempsey picked up the island on radar. A small blip, 85 kilometers ahead. Iwo bearing 130, he reported. The crew felt a collective release of tension. They might actually survive this. Then the fuel gauge for Tank 1 dropped to 0. Engine 1 coughed, sputtered, and died. Now they were flying on 2 engines. The tower at Iwo Jima was a tent with a radio and 3 exhausted Marines. They'd been handling emergency landings all night. Damaged B-29s, fighters with empty guns, transports carrying wounded. The dirt runway was littered with aircraft in various states of disrepair. When Hensley's call came through, the controller didn't hide his concern. "Storm Bell, be advised the field is under marginal conditions. Visibility 2 miles in ground fog. Approach lights non-operational." "Copy, we're coming in regardless," Hensley replied. "2 engines, minimal fuel, landing gear status unknown." "Understood. You're cleared for straight-in approach, runway 28. Emergency equipment will be standing by." Hensley lined up on the runway heading. The island was visible now, a dark smudge rising from the Pacific. Mount Suribachi on the southern end, the airfield carved into the volcanic plateau on the north. No trees, no vegetation, just black sand and shell craters. "Lower the gear." Alcott pressed the landing gear lever. Nothing happened. No hydraulic pressure to move the mechanism. They'd have to do it manually. Cooley and the crew chief climbed into the wheel wells, fighting against the slipstream and cramped space. They found the manual release cranks and began turning. Each revolution extended the gear a few inches. It took 5 minutes of hard labor before the 3 indicator lights showed green. Hensley felt the gear lock into place. The additional drag slowed them further. They were now at 240 kilometers per hour, barely above stall. He added power to the 2 working engines, but they were already at maximum output. The runway appeared through the fog. Gray dirt, marked with white paint. Emergency vehicles lined both sides, their crews watching the crippled bomber approach. Hensley judged the angle, the speed, the wind. He'd flown this approach 1,000 times in his mind, calculating the perfect glide path. Now he had one chance to get it right. The main wheels touched at 6:47 a.m. The B-29 bounced once, settled, and Hensley applied the brakes. Nothing. No hydraulic pressure for the brake system either. They were rolling down the runway at 160 kilometers per hour, with no way to stop. Hensley reversed thrust on the 2 working engines. The propellers bit into the air, creating massive drag. The B-29 slowed. 140 kilometers per hour. 120. 100. The end of the runway was approaching fast. At 80 kilometers per hour, the left main tire blew, shredded by volcanic rock. The aircraft slewed sideways, skidding on its belly. Metal screamed against stone. Then, finally, it stopped. Total distance, 300. He was too tired. They counted the damage systematically. 612 projectile impacts, calibers ranging from 7.7 millimeters to 75 millimeters. 2 engines inoperative. 1 engine compromised. Fuel tank 2 destroyed. Hydraulic system failed. Electrical system running on emergency battery. Oxygen system depleted. Cabin pressure lost. Landing gear mechanism damaged. And somehow, impossibly, every crew member alive. The Boeing engineers who examined the wreckage wrote detailed reports. They praised the redundancy of the B-29 systems, 3 independent hydraulic circuits, backup electrical generators, self-sealing fuel tanks that had mostly worked. The structural reinforcements added in 1944 had proven their worth. Without those improvements, the aircraft would have broken apart over Tokyo. But the engineers also noted modifications needed. Engine cooling remained inadequate. The self-sealing fuel tanks failed under sustained combat damage. The hydraulic lines were too exposed. Their recommendations would influence the design of the next generation of heavy bombers. Hensley wrote his own report, 3 pages of technical observations, calculations, and recommendations. He noted that manual engine management had extended Engine 3's life by 90 minutes. That weight reduction had increased range by 40 kilometers. That maintaining altitude between 8,000 and 10,000 feet had optimized fuel consumption while preserving glide capability. His report circulated quietly through Air Force technical channels. It became part of the Emergency Procedures Manual for long-range bomber operations. Flight 87, they called it. Structural Endurance Validation. The Storm Belle flew again, repaired over 3 weeks by a team that worked around the clock. It returned to combat operations. Hensley and his crew flew 6 more missions over Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe before the war ended. They received commendations, letters of appreciation, mentions in the unit history, but no medals. The mission had been successful but unremarkable in the context of a war where hundreds of B-29s flew every night. Hensley didn't mind. He'd never flown for recognition. What stayed with him was the calculation. The moment over the Pacific, when he'd realized they might not make it, and had done the math anyway. 70 liters per minute times 90 minutes equals 6,300 liters consumed. Distance to Iwo Jima divided by fuel remaining equals, maybe, possibly, if everything went right. And it had. Barely. After the war, Hensley returned to Kansas, finished his engineering degree, got a job with Boeing designing flight control systems. Never talked much about his war experiences. When people asked about his time in the Pacific, he'd say it was mostly boring, flying straight and level for hours, dealing with mechanical problems, the usual stuff. He never mentioned the night he'd flown a dying bomber through fire and fighters and fuel starvation to a landing on a volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean. That was just math. Just engineering, just doing what needed to be done. The Storm Belle was scrapped in Guam in 1946, disassembled piece by piece. The engines melted down for aluminum. The airframe cut into sections and loaded onto ships bound for American steel mills. Nothing remained except photographs and maintenance records, but the flight lived on in technical manuals and training documents. A case study in emergency procedures, an example of how small decisions compound into survival, how measuring risk in liters and minutes and degrees can make the difference between completing the mission and disappearing into the Pacific. The final report, filed by the Boeing chief engineer, contained a single sentence that captured everything. The machine endured because it was operated as an organism. Wounded, but functional. Hensley would have agreed with that assessment. He'd spent 6 hours treating the B-29 like a living thing, listening to its breathing, feeling its pain, making adjustments to keep it alive. And in the end, the machine had responded. Not through heroics or luck, but through the accumulated effect of 1,000 small technical decisions. The war taught him that some problems couldn't be solved with bravery or determination. They required calculation, precision, a willingness to work within constraints that seemed impossible, to find the narrow path between protocol and necessity. That lesson stayed with him for the rest of his life. Every time he faced a problem that seemed unsolvable, he'd remember the fuel gauge dropping, the engines failing, the calculation that said they wouldn't make it. And then he'd remember that calculations were just the starting point. What mattered was understanding when to trust the numbers and when to trust something deeper. The Storm Belle had made it home not because the math said it would work, but because someone had been willing to make it work despite what the math suggested. That was the real lesson. That was what the engineers at Boeing understood when they studied the wreckage and wrote their reports. Sometimes you had to be willing to solve for variables that couldn't be quantified. Human determination, technical skill, the sum of small decisions made under pressure. Those factors didn't appear in the equations, but they were the difference between a successful mission and a statistic. On March 10, 1945, above a burning city, and across 1,500 miles of hostile ocean. Those variables had been enough.